So what we're doing here is, in the video, I think it was the last video about this car, the one before it, where I got everything located here. What I quickly realized is I can't run the big cap HEI distributor that I wanted because it hits the hood latch. Even though, I mean, well, the motor is where it is, it's not moving, but the motor is all the way as far forward as the mounts will let it go. So there really isn't even an option to move it any more forward. And it doesn't clear the hood latch. And yes, they make MSD little small cap distributors and whatnot, but the whole point of replacing parts on this car is I want it to be as reliable as it can be, and I want to have the best parts availability that I can. So if I go put some custom aftermarket, hard to find distributor in there, then I really haven't met that requirement. And when it breaks, I'm going to be waiting for parts or really in a bind. So they do make a TBI, the TBI style HEI distributor, such as this one here. This one is for a V6. Same module though. This style, it doesn't have points and it doesn't have a mechanical or a vacuum advance, but it's a small cap. So it will clear the hood latch just fine. The plug wires don't get into the hood latch or anything. But the problem is it doesn't have a mechanical advance or a vacuum advance. So I need a computer in order to run the timing. This is pretty well outside of my wheelhouse of what I usually mess with, but I needed to modify the computer here. So this is a MegaSquirt 2 version 3 computer that I bought for the Datsun, I think in 2019, no, it was 2018. That's been a minute. Anyways, I bought it back then to try and use on the original engine. That obviously didn't pan out. And what I'm doing here is setting the computer up to run a 8-pin HEI ignition module, one of these guys. So I've had this guy in the car. Prior to now, this guy was just going to run the fuel pump, and it was going to do the PWM output for the radiator fan. But since it's in the car, super convenient and way underutilized, so I had to do some modifying to it here, just following the manual, little instruction manual that came with it. So I had to put 2 resistors in here, and these 2 green wires I just put in as part of this. It's just a circuit modification where it'll hopefully be set up correctly to drive this ignition module. So the computer's back in, being powered up by this guy. And basically here's how this is working. So power is coming in here on this wire to the coil. The coil then sends 12 volts out to power the ignition module. This white wire coming from the module going back to the coil is the trigger wire that actually triggers the coil to fire. This other white wire here, I believe that guy is just the one you would tie onto if you basically had a coil negative tack. And then there's 4 wires right here on the module. This innermost one, black with the red stripe, this is pin G. And this on the MegaSquirt gets tied to the sensor ground circuit. So there's other sensors that get tied to this wire. This module just gets tied to it along with them. This next wire here is, I lost the tag for it. We just look at this guy. So this next wire, so it was G, next wire is B. So wire B is the bypass, which on the MegaSquirt I've connected to spare 3, so that's spare wire 3. And this bypass wire is basically communication between this module and the computer as far as who needs to be doing what. So if this wire doesn't have a signal on it going from the computer to this module just assumes that it's all on its own and it's got to do its own thing. So this is actually the wire that you disconnect whenever you want to set timing on a TBI. So you disconnect this wire, this module says, okay, I'm on my own, no problem, and it goes to no advance so that you can set the timing. And from what I was reading, you technically probably could drive short distances with it, because apparently at some RPM it'll just throw another 15 degrees of advance into it. Apparently there's no advance curve actually built into these. It'll just once it hits a certain RPM, it throws some timing at it just to try and keep the motor happy, kind of like a limp home mode maybe. But anyways, after the engine is started and it's run for a few seconds, the computer says, hey, everything looks good, and it'll send a signal through this wire to the module. And once the module sees that signal, then it'll start listening to what the computer says, and it'll go to whatever advance the computer tells it to go to. This purple and white stripe wire here, it's going to be pin R. That is the tach output from the ignition module back to the MegaSquirt. So I just tied that to the tach wire. And then this last wire, which is E, that bolt there is what grounds this module to that body, by the way. So pin E is going to be this white wire down here. And this is the wire that the MegaSquirt actually sends the advance, basically the signal of however much advance the computer wants comes through this wire into the module from the computer. So in my case, I'm using Spark A. That's the pin, that's the wire from the MegaSquirt unit. So it says, hey, you know, I want 20 degrees of advance. Well, that signal comes through on that wire into this module, and then the module takes care of the rest. And if anybody was wondering, that is the magnetic pickup, that little star deal. So there you can see the shaft move. And you can tell this one is for a V8 because it has 8 little points on what I think is called the reluctor. So there really isn't a whole lot to it. It's pretty simple. And since I have everything powered up here, if I give the distributor a spin, it's got really good spark. And just to wrap this up, I got the wiring pretty well sorted, I think. So I got the coil mounted here just to an intake bolt, and that might change a little bit because this is not the intake or even the engine that is going to stay in this car. So that might change a little bit. But I used one of the factory brackets to mount the coil right here, and I like having it there. I think it looks pretty decent. And then I got all of the wires terminated into the 4-pin plug. The only ones that I don't know about is the tach reference going to the computer. It has the reference wire, a ground, and the shield. It's called a shielded twisted pair. You have two basically sensor circuit wires, and there's a shield that goes around it that you're supposed to ground, I think, in certain circumstances. And basically it just helps keep any kind of electronic interference from, you know, the coil or any of this other stuff from getting into the actual signal wire and going to the computer and giving it a false reading. For this setup, I'm not super certain what I'm supposed to do with it. I didn't find a quick answer, so I'll have to do some reading on it, but I just left them there. They're just hanging out for now until I can figure out what to do with them. This guy will probably end up getting tied to the Intellitronics gauges. I got to double check the wiring on those too and make sure that's how they want to be wired. While I was editing the video, I realized I forgot something. I forgot to put in some kind of connector to disconnect the bypass wire between the module and the distributor so that you can set base timing. So I went ahead and did that here. I figured this was a pretty convenient spot. On my S10 Blazer, for some reason it's up under the passenger side carpet, up under the dash. Really inconvenient place to get to, and I actually had to Google it to figure out where the thing was even at. So not doing that, so I went with this spot here. I figured that was pretty convenient. If you're working on the distributor, you're already right here. So to set the timing, it'll be disconnect this guy, and then once the base timing is set, plug it back in, and the computer will take over the timing. And I went ahead, and all the crimp connects I've done, I've been heat shrinking them, and on the ones that I can, I will also use the soldering gun and solder the wire to the actual crimp itself. So I've been doing that a lot, and I like doing that a lot better, but I figured this one isn't as, I mean, it's still insulated, and I figure it's not as big of a deal because it's up here high in the engine bay. But yeah, glad I didn't forget that, because that would have been kind of a pain to figure out later. This plug back here is actually for a Nissan throttle position sensor. This was one that I put into the wiring harness back when this still had the L28 in it, because that was an easy way of putting a modern TPS on the L28 is you go with whatever, I forget what car it even came off of, but some newer sensor. This is the plug it uses. Just to keep the wires protected, I'm just leaving the plug there. At some point this car may have fuel injection, and then I'll have to cut that off and lengthen the wires to a sensor that I actually want to use. So I'm just going to leave that guy there for the time being. But yeah, and I left plenty of slack on the wire. I mean, I have that range of motion to play with, so I feel like that'll be pretty good. And then lastly, I got the power coming to both the coil and the ignition module sorted. Again, that's this wire here, and that's coming from this guy right here. So kind of the way I set this up is I didn't want to have a whole bunch of ignition circuit wires running around. So basically what I did is I have 12 gauge switched ignition wire coming from a relay over here. It runs and it's tied to this post here. And then on also tied onto this post is that new coil wire that I just mentioned. So pretty much the coil, the module, they have a direct link to 12 volt ignition power. This other side of this breaker, it's not a fuse, it's a breaker, so it'll self reset if there's an issue. This side of it is just for any other crap that the car needs. So right now I just have one wire on it, and it's running over to that fuse block. So it's powering some real low amp circuits. So the amp, I'm not worried about the current draw of it, but it's powering some low amp circuits over there. And then all this breaker is here for is I just felt better having it so that if there is a problem in one of those circuits, it theoretically shouldn't cause the car to shut off. So if I think past me hopefully sized that right, but if I did size it right, then what should happen is, you know, if it blows, it should blow a fuse over there, and if it trips this breaker should reset, and it shouldn't ever cause a problem with the rest of this circuit that runs back over here. So we'll see how that actually works out in reality. But yeah, I'm pretty pleased with this, and I think I'm going to call this good.